The knife came out of the dark before anyone in the hall could scream a warning. Queen Voreth Nisara felt the air shift a heartbeat before the blade reached her throat, and in that heartbeat she understood she was about to die in front of her own court. The banquet hall of Xanthara's high palace had been filled a moment ago with music and low laughter, with servants carrying trays of glowing fruit, and nobles trading careful compliments. Now it was filled with silence, so complete she could hear her own pulse. Then a hand closed around the attacker's wrist. It was not a guard's hand. It was not the hand of any of the armored warriors who stood at the edges of the room, frozen in shock, too far away to help. It was the hand of her husband, Elias Thorne, the quiet human diplomat the court had spent a year mocking behind painted fans and folded arms. He twisted the wrist with a motion so smooth it barely looked like effort, and the knife clattered to the marble floor. Voreth stared at him. She did not understand what she was seeing. Elias was supposed to be harmless. That was the whole point of him. When the peace treaty between her empire and the human colonies had been signed 2 years earlier, sealed with a marriage neither of them had asked for, the elders of her court had assured her that the human envoy was a scholar, not a soldier, a man of books and treaties, sent to represent his people in name only. He spoke softly. He rarely raised his voice in council. He spent his evenings reading rather than training in the yard with her generals. She had married him the way one signs a contract, expecting nothing more from him than polite company and the occasional useful insight into human customs. She had never once imagined he could move like this. The attacker, a masked figure in servant's robes, tried to pull free and reach for a second blade hidden at his belt. Elias did not let him. He stepped in close, faster than Voreth had ever seen a human move, and in 3 efficient motions had the man pinned face down against the banquet table, disarmed and gasping, before the palace guards even finished drawing their weapons. For a long moment, nobody in the hall spoke. Voreth's chest was still tight with the aftershock of nearly dying, but a new feeling was rising underneath it, something sharper and more confusing. She looked at her husband, at the calm set of his jaw, the steady way he held the struggling man down without any wasted motion, and she thought, not for the first time, but for the first time with real weight behind it, I do not know this man at all. The guards finally reached them and took the attacker into custody, dragging him from the hall as the court began to whisper. Elias straightened his sleeves, glanced once at Voreth to make sure she was unharmed, and then, as if nothing unusual had happened, reached for his wine glass and took a slow sip. "You should sit," he said quietly. "Your hands are shaking." She had not noticed her hands were shaking. She looked down at them, then back up at him, searching his face for some explanation. He offered none. He simply guided her to her seat with a gentle hand at her elbow, as though the last 30 seconds had been an ordinary interruption to an ordinary dinner, and not proof that everything she believed about him was wrong. The rest of the banquet dissolved into confusion. Guards swept the hall for other threats. Nobles clustered together, murmuring theories about who had sent the attacker and why. Voreth sat rigid in her chair, barely tasting the food set before her, her mind turning over the same question again and again. A scholar did not move like that. A diplomat did not disarm a trained assassin in under 4 seconds without breaking a sweat. Whatever Elias Thorne was, he was not what she had been told. She did not confront him that night. She was too shaken, too aware of the eyes still on her from every corner of the hall, and some old instinct told her that whatever truth lay beneath her husband's calm exterior was not one to drag into public view. So she smiled when she needed to smile, thanked the guards for their quick response, and allowed the banquet to limp toward its official end. It was only later, alone in the private wing of the palace, that she let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Her chambers overlooked the eastern gardens, where bioluminescent trees cast a soft blue light over stone paths and quiet fountains. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the light shift and thinking about the way Elias had moved. It replayed in her mind on a loop, sharper each time. The speed of his hand, the precision of his grip, the complete absence of hesitation. A soft knock came at her door. "Come in," she said without turning. Elias entered, still dressed in his formal robes from the banquet, though he had loosened the high collar. He crossed the room and stood a respectful distance away, waiting for her to speak first, which was unusual. Normally he filled silences with easy conversation, about nothing in particular, harmless observations about the weather, or the strange customs of her court. Tonight he said nothing at all. "You saved my life," she finally said. "I did what anyone would do." "No." She turned to face him. "Anyone would have frozen. Anyone would have screamed for the guards and hoped they arrived in time. What you did was not the reaction of an ordinary man." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. For a moment she thought he might actually answer her honestly. Instead, he offered a small, careful smile, the same one he always used to deflect questions he did not want to answer. "I spent time in dangerous places before I came here," he said. "A diplomat learns to protect himself, or he does not survive long enough to be useful." It was a reasonable answer. It was also, she was now certain, a lie, or at least not the whole truth. She had spent 2 years learning to read the small signals of his face, the same way she had learned to read the faces of generals and spies throughout her life. And she recognized the particular stillness that came over people when they were choosing their words with great care. She let the matter drop. For now. She was too tired, and too shaken, to press further that night. But something had shifted between them in the banquet hall. Some quiet certainty she had carried for 2 years now cracked open, and she found she could not simply set the feeling aside and return to the comfortable indifference that had defined their marriage until this point. Over the following days, the investigation into the attack consumed the palace. The masked attacker, once questioned, revealed little of use, only that he had been paid through intermediaries he could not name, and that his instructions had been simple: eliminate the queen during a moment of public vulnerability. Her generals doubled the guard around her chambers. Her advisors debated which of her rivals might be behind the plot, though no one could point to solid evidence. Voreth found herself watching Elias more closely during this time, not with suspicion exactly, but with a new and unfamiliar curiosity. She noticed things she had somehow overlooked before. The careful way he positioned himself in rooms, always near an exit, always able to see the door. The quiet efficiency of his morning routine, which involved exercises she had assumed were simple stretches, but now recognized, watching more carefully, as something closer to combat drills. The fact that he never seemed surprised by anything, as though he had already considered every possible danger before it arrived. She began to wonder how much of the man she thought she knew had been a performance, carefully maintained for 2 years, and how much of it was real. Her cousin Kael'thas visited a week after the attack, ostensibly to offer his concern and support, though Voreth had never fully trusted him. He was ambitious in the quiet, patient way of men who believed the throne would eventually fall into their hands if they simply waited long enough, and his sympathy always felt a half-degree too smooth, too rehearsed. "A terrible thing," he said, settling into a chair across from her in the council room, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "To think an assassin could get so close during a formal banquet. Our security has grown lax." "Our security performed admirably," Voreth said evenly. "The threat was neutralized before any harm was done." "Ah, yes. By your husband, I hear." Kael'thas's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. How fortunate that the harmless scholar turned out to have such useful skills. There was something in the way he said it, a faint edge beneath the polite surface, that made Voreth's instincts prickle. She studied his face, searching for any sign of what lay beneath his carefully neutral expression. But Kael'thas had always been skilled at hiding his true intentions, perhaps even more skilled than she had given him credit for. "Fortunate indeed," she said simply, and let the conversation move on to other matters, though she filed the moment away carefully in her memory, the way she filed away every small detail that might later prove important. That evening, she found Elias in the palace library, surrounded by star charts and old treaties, exactly where she expected to find him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, watching the warm, familiar way his expression softened at the sight of her, she almost let herself forget the questions gathering in her mind. Almost. "I want to know who you really are," she said, closing the door behind her. He set down the scroll he had been reading, and this time, when he looked at her, there was no easy smile, no practiced deflection, just a long, considering silence, the kind of silence that told her he was finally deciding whether to tell her the truth. "That is a longer conversation than we have time for tonight," he said quietly. but I promise you this. Everything I have done since the day I arrived in this palace, I have done to protect you and this peace between our people. Whatever else you learn about me, please hold on to that." It was not the answer she wanted. It was, she suspected, all the answer she was going to get tonight. But as she studied his face in the low light of the library, she found herself believing him, even as every instinct she had spent a lifetime sharpening told her that there was far more to Elias Thorne than either of them had yet spoken aloud. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, in the shadowed corners of a city that never fully slept, the people who had ordered the attack were already planning their next move, and whatever secrets her husband was keeping, Voreth had the growing, unshakable sense that she was going to need every one of them before this was over. 3 weeks passed before the next attempt came, and this time it did not come as a blade in a crowded hall. It came as a fire. Voreth woke to the smell of smoke curling under her chamber door, and the distant sound of shouting somewhere in the lower wing of the palace. She was on her feet before she had fully registered what was happening, pulling a robe around her shoulders, her mind already racing through the layout of escape routes she had memorized as a child. The door to her chambers burst open before she reached it, and Elias stood there, fully dressed despite the hour, his expression tight with urgency rather than panic. "The East Archive is burning," he said. "It was not an accident. Come with me, quickly, and stay close." She did not argue. Whatever questions still lingered between them, whatever secrets he had not yet shared, she trusted his instincts now in a way she had never expected to. He led her not toward the main corridor, thick with smoke and fleeing servants, but through a narrow side passage she barely remembered existed, one that curved behind the old kitchens and emerged near the outer courtyard. "How do you know this palace better than I do?" she asked, breathless, as they emerged into the cool night air. "I made it my business to know," he said simply, scanning the courtyard with quick, practiced eyes, before guiding her toward a sheltered alcove where 2 of her personal guards stood waiting, having clearly been summoned by some signal she had not seen him give. The fire was contained within the hour, though the East Archive, home to centuries of treaties and historical records, was gutted beyond saving. In the gray light of early morning, Voreth stood at the edge of the ruined wing, with her generals and advisors, listening to reports that only deepened her unease. The fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, which meant it had not been an accident, and it had started in the wing closest to the private family quarters, which meant whoever had set it either wanted to destroy specific records or wanted the chaos to provide cover for something far more dangerous. "They were testing our response," Elias said quietly, standing beside her as the smoke thinned into pale morning mist. "Learning how quickly your guards move, which corridors clear fastest, which ones you use to escape. This was not an attack. This was reconnaissance." Voreth turned to study him, struck again by how naturally the language of strategy came from his mouth, as though he had spent years thinking in exactly these terms. "You speak like a man who has planned attacks himself." "I speak like a man who has spent his life trying to stop them," he said, and there was something old and tired in his voice that made her believe him, even as it raised a dozen new questions she did not yet know how to ask. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to the palace. Guards were tripled. Advisors argued in every council session about who could be responsible, with suspicion falling across half the noble houses of the empire, though no one dared speak Kael'thas's name aloud, not with him sitting quietly in the corner of every meeting, his expression carefully arranged into concern that never quite reached his eyes. Voreth began spending more time with Elias, not out of the polite obligation that had defined their marriage for 2 years, but out of genuine need. She found herself seeking his opinion in council, watching the way his careful, measured suggestions often cut straight to problems her generals had circled around for hours. She found herself walking beside him in the gardens in the evenings, no longer making empty conversation but discussing real strategy, real fears, the growing sense that something larger than a single assassination attempt was unfolding around them. "Tell me about your training," she said one evening, as they walked along the winding garden path beneath the blue glow of the trees. Not the diplomat's version, the truth. Elias was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might deflect again, the way he always had before. But this time, he stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "When I was young," he said, Earth's colonies were still fighting for recognition among the older powers of this region. My people needed representatives who could survive in dangerous places, who could protect fragile agreements, even when those agreements had enemies willing to kill for their failure. I was chosen for that kind of work when I was very young, trained for years in skills that had nothing to do with diplomacy in the traditional sense. A soldier disguised as a diplomat. Something like that, though I have always believed the two roles serve the same purpose. Diplomacy fails when there is no one willing to protect it. I came to your court prepared for exactly this, for threats against the treaty, against the peace our marriage was meant to secure. I did not expect, he paused, choosing his next words with visible care. I did not expect to come to care for you the way I have. That part was never part of any plan. Voreth felt something shift in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, though she pushed the feeling aside for now, unwilling to let it distract from the danger still circling them. Why did you not tell me sooner? Because the fewer people who knew what I truly was, the safer you would be. Because if your enemies believed I was harmless, they would underestimate the one advantage standing between you and their blades. I am telling you now, because I believe you deserve to know, and because I think we are running out of time to pretend otherwise. They stood together in the quiet garden, the truth finally spoken between them, and Voreth found herself studying her husband with new eyes, seeing not the quiet scholar the court had mocked, but the trained protector who had been standing beside her all along, hidden in plain sight. The next attack, when it came, was far more direct. It happened during a diplomatic gathering held to reassure the noble houses that the palace remained secure despite the recent troubles. Representatives from every major family filled the grand hall, along with several foreign envoys invited to demonstrate the strength of the empire's continuing alliances. Voreth stood at the center of the gathering, composed and regal despite the tension coiled tight beneath her calm exterior, while Elias remained close at her side, his eyes constantly moving across the crowd in a way she now recognized as vigilance rather than simple attentiveness. The first sign of trouble was small, easy to miss. A servant carrying a tray of drinks moved through the crowd with a gait that was subtly wrong, too deliberate, too focused on a single destination rather than the natural drift of someone simply doing their job. Elias noticed it before Voreth did, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on her arm. "Do not move toward the dais," he murmured. "Something is wrong." Before she could ask what he meant, the servant dropped the tray, and beneath the shattering glass, 3 more figures at the edges of the hall moved in unison, discarding their formal robes to reveal darker clothing beneath, weapons drawn in a single coordinated motion. The hall erupted into screaming as guests scattered toward the exits, and for a moment the chaos was so complete that Voreth lost sight of everything except the nearest attacker closing the distance toward her with terrifying speed. Elias moved before she could react, placing himself between her and the threat, with a calm that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. He did not draw a weapon immediately, instead using the crowd's panic to his advantage, guiding Voreth backward through the chaos, toward a side exit, while assessing the positions of all 3 attackers with quick, sweeping glances. "There are more of them than the hall shows," he said quietly. "This was planned to overwhelm the guards, not just threaten you directly." Palace guards finally began pushing through the fleeing crowd, engaging 2 of the attackers near the main entrance, but the third had broken away, cutting through a side corridor that Voreth realized, with a jolt of fear, led directly toward the private wing, where the treaty archives, the true records of the peace between their peoples, were kept. "They are not here for me," she said suddenly. "They are here for the treaty itself." Elias's expression sharpened with understanding. If the original agreement is destroyed, the legal foundation of the peace collapses. Without it, the houses who oppose the alliance could argue the marriage and the treaty were never properly bound. They moved quickly, cutting through a service corridor that ran parallel to the main hall, emerging near the archive just as the third attacker reached the heavy doors. Elias reached him first, and this time, Voreth watched without the shock of their first encounter, watched with a strange, steady pride as her husband disarmed the man with brutal efficiency, subduing him without lasting harm, exactly as he had done during the banquet weeks before. Guards arrived moments later to secure the attacker, and as the chaos in the grand hall finally settled, With the other two conspirators captured, and the gathering guests slowly calming, Voreth allowed herself a single, steadying breath. "This was not random," she said to Elias, once they had a moment of relative privacy. "Whoever is behind this has been planning for weeks, maybe longer. They know the palace, they know our patterns. This required inside knowledge." "I agree," Elias said grimly, "which means we are not looking for an outside enemy. We are looking for someone within these walls, someone with access to information that should have been protected." Voreth thought of Kael'thas, standing in the corner of every council meeting with his carefully arranged concern, always present, always watching, always somehow just outside the reach of suspicion. She had refused to voice her doubts about her own cousin without proof, unwilling to fracture the fragile unity of her court over mere instinct. But instinct, she was beginning to understand, was not something to dismiss lightly, not when it came from years of learning to read the people around her. "We need proof," she said quietly, "and we need it before they try again." Elias nodded, his expression grim but resolute, and for the first time since their marriage began, Voreth felt as though she was not facing the growing danger alone. Whatever secrets he had carried, whatever hidden skills he had spent years mastering, he had chosen, finally and fully, to stand beside her, rather than behind the careful mask he had worn for so long. And as the captured attacker was dragged away for questioning, she found herself looking toward the future with a mixture of dread and something close to hope, knowing that the true architect of this conspiracy was still out there, still hidden, still waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The captured attacker gave up nothing during questioning, not even under the patient, methodical pressure of Voreth's most experienced interrogators. He spoke of intermediaries he had never seen face to face, payments delivered through anonymous couriers, instructions passed along in coded messages that led nowhere. Whoever had organized the attacks had built layer after layer of protection around themselves, and Voreth began to understand that she was not dealing with a single desperate rival, but with someone who had been planning this for a very long time, with patience and resources far beyond what any ordinary noble house could muster alone. Elias spent his nights poring over the coded messages recovered from the attacker, working by lamplight long after Voreth had gone to bed, and more than once she woke to find him still at his desk, papers spread before him, his expression drawn with the particular exhaustion of a man chasing an answer just out of reach. "You should rest," she told him one such night, standing in the doorway of his study with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the chill. "I will, once I understand this pattern." He gestured to the papers before him, rows of symbols that meant nothing to her untrained eye. "The code is not one I recognize from any current diplomatic channel, which is strange. It suggests training, formal training, the kind taught only within certain circles." "What circles?" He looked up at her, and something in his expression told her the answer before he spoke it aloud. "The kind I was trained in myself. This code shares structural similarities with methods used by intelligence operatives from my own people, adapted, but not disguised well enough to hide the origin entirely." Voreth felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "You believe someone from Earth is involved in this conspiracy. I believe it is possible. Whether that person acts alone, or in cooperation with someone here in your court, I cannot yet say. But if I am right, then this threat is larger than a single ambitious noble seeking your throne. This may be an attempt to unravel the entire peace between our peoples, orchestrated by someone with access to methods that should never have left the training halls where I first learned them." The revelation settled heavily over the following days, reshaping the investigation into something far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Voreth called a private council of her most trusted advisors, deliberately excluding Kael'thas from the gathering under the pretense of a minor scheduling matter, and laid out everything they had learned. The room fell into a tense, uneasy silence. "If this conspiracy reaches into the human colonies as well," said her chief advisor, an older woman named Colette Marsh who had served the crown for 3 decades, "then we are no longer simply hunting a traitor within these walls. We are hunting a plot that spans 2 worlds, and we do not yet know how deep it runs." "Then we work faster," Voreth said, "and we work quietly. If word spreads that we suspect a conspiracy of this size, whoever is behind it will simply retreat further into the shadows, and we may never catch them at all." They agreed to proceed with careful discretion, gathering evidence in secret while maintaining the appearance of ordinary palace operations to the outside world. Elias took charge of decoding the remaining messages, drawing on knowledge Voreth suspected he had never expected to use again once he left his former life behind. Voreth herself began quietly reviewing the movements and correspondence of every noble house, with a plausible motive, cross-referencing timelines against the dates of each attack, searching for any pattern that might point toward the truth. It was during this careful investigation that she first noticed something troubling about her cousin's recent travels. Kael'thas had left the palace twice in the past month, ostensibly to oversee matters on his family's estate in the northern provinces, journeys that should have taken only a few days each, but had stretched to nearly a week on both occasions. When she quietly inquired with the estate steward, under the guise of routine correspondence, she learned that Kael'thas had never actually arrived at the estate during either trip. She brought the discovery to Elias that evening, finding him in his study surrounded by the usual scatter of coded papers, though his expression brightened slightly at the sight of her, the way it always did now, a warmth that had grown steadily between them over the past weeks, despite the danger surrounding them. "He lied about his whereabouts," Elias said, once she had explained what she found. "Twice. That is not the behavior of an innocent man, even accounting for the usual secrecy nobles maintain around personal affairs." "I want to know where he actually went," Voreth said, "but I cannot simply have him followed without raising suspicion. If he learns we doubt him, he may accelerate whatever plan he is pursuing, or destroy evidence before we can find it." Elias considered this for a long moment, then set down the papers in his hands with the particular stillness she had come to recognize as the moment before he offered a plan he knew she might not immediately embrace. "Let me follow him myself, the next time he leaves the palace. I have skills for this kind of work, that your guards, however loyal, do not possess. And unlike a soldier in uniform, I can move through this city without drawing attention. It is dangerous. Everything about this situation is dangerous," he said gently. "But I would rather face that danger directly than wait here, wondering what he is planning while more attacks come." She wanted to refuse, some old protective instinct rising sharply at the thought of sending him into danger without her at his side. But she also understood, watching the quiet determination in his face, that this was exactly the kind of work he had spent his life training for, and that refusing him would accomplish nothing, except delaying the truth they both desperately needed to uncover. "If you are not back within 2 days," she said finally, "I will send every guard in this palace after you, and I will not care what secrets that exposes." A faint smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. "I would expect nothing less." Kael'thas left the palace again 4 days later, claiming urgent business at a trading post along the southern border. Elias departed shortly after, dressed in the plain, unremarkable clothing of a traveling merchant, carrying nothing that would mark him as anything other than an ordinary man moving through the crowded streets beyond the palace walls. Voreth spent those 2 days in a state of controlled anxiety she was careful never to show in council, throwing herself into the ordinary business of ruling, while her thoughts constantly circled back to wherever Elias might be, whatever danger he might be facing without her. He returned on the evening of the second day, slipping back into the palace through a service entrance and making his way directly to her chambers, his clothing dusty from travel, but his eyes bright with the particular sharpness of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. Kael'thas did not go to any trading post, he said, once the door was securely closed behind him. He met with a man in a warehouse district 3 hours from here, a man I recognized, though I wish I had not. "Who?" "A former operative from my own people's intelligence division. A man named Gareth Holloway, dishonorably removed from service years ago after it was discovered he had been selling classified methods to the highest bidder. I had heard rumors he was still active somewhere in this region, but I never imagined he would find his way into your cousin's employ." Voreth felt the pieces of the conspiracy finally beginning to align into a shape she could understand, though the shape that emerged filled her with a cold, steady fury. "Kael'thas hired a traitor from your own people to teach him how to attack me without leaving evidence that would point back to him." "That is my belief, yes, and if Holloway has been advising him for as long as I suspect, based on the sophistication of the recent attacks, then Kael'thas has access to knowledge and methods that go far beyond anything your court's security was ever prepared to face. Then we need proof that will hold, something undeniable, something that will convince even the most reluctant members of my council that my own cousin has been trying to destroy me from within. Elias nodded slowly, though his expression carried a weight of caution she recognized well by now. I followed them long enough to overhear part of their conversation. Caelthus spoke of a final plan, something timed to coincide with the upcoming High Council session, when every noble house will be gathered in one place to formally ratify the continuing peace treaty. If he intends to strike then, in front of the entire court, it will not simply be an assassination attempt. It will be a coup, staged in full view of everyone who matters, timed to appear as chaos rather than calculated betrayal. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a physical thing. Voreth walked slowly to the window, looking out over the gardens now cloaked in darkness, thinking of the High Council session only days away, the gathering of every noble house, every foreign envoy, every fragile thread of the peace she had spent years trying to build. We cannot simply accuse him without proof, she said finally. The other noble houses would see it as an attempt to eliminate a rival through slander, especially given how carefully he has cultivated his public reputation. We need to catch him in the act, or find evidence so clear that denial becomes impossible. Then we prepare, Elias said, moving to stand beside her at the window. We know when he intends to strike now. We know, at least in general terms, who is advising him. That is more than we had a week ago, and it gives us the chance to be ready rather than surprised. Voreth turned to look at him, at the man who had walked into danger alone to bring her this knowledge, who had spent 2 years hiding an entire life beneath the quiet mask of a scholar, and who now stood beside her not as a diplomatic formality, but as the truest ally she had in this fight. Whatever fear still lingered in her chest, it was matched now by a fierce, steady resolve. Then we will be ready, she said, and when Caelthus makes his move, he will find that the harmless husband he underestimated, and the queen he thought he could remove without consequence, are prepared for exactly the attack he intends to bring. Outside, the gardens lay quiet and still under the pale glow of the trees, holding no hint of the storm that was gathering, day by day, toward the High Council session, and the confrontation that would finally decide the fate of the throne. The peace between two worlds, and the future Voreth and Elias had only just begun to imagine building together. The days leading up to the High Council session passed in a careful, quiet blur of preparation. Voreth could not afford to change the visible rhythm of palace life, could not let even the smallest shift in her behavior alert Caelthus to the fact that his secret had been discovered. She continued attending council meetings where he sat in his usual corner, offering his usual carefully measured concern, and she found it took every ounce of her considerable self-control to meet his eyes, without revealing the fury simmering beneath her calm expression. Elias worked closely with Colette Marsh and a small, trusted circle of guards to build a plan that would allow them to expose Caelthus without endangering the hundreds of nobles and envoys who would gather for the council session. It was delicate work. They could not simply arrest him beforehand, not without proof strong enough to survive scrutiny from houses loyal to his family. They could not warn the other nobles without risking word reaching him through some hidden channel of loyalty they had not yet uncovered. Instead, they built a trap, patient and precise, designed to let Caelthus reveal himself in front of witnesses who could not later claim the accusation had been fabricated. He will bring Holloway's methods with him, Elias explained one evening, spreading a rough sketch of the council hall across the table between them, which means he will rely on some element of surprise, likely disguised operatives among the household staff, similar to the attack during the banquet. If we can identify and quietly remove those operatives before the session begins, without alerting him to our knowledge, he will be forced to act with his own hands, or not act at all. And if he does not act at all, then we have still stripped away his weapon, and we continue watching until he makes his next attempt. But I do not believe a man this committed to seizing power will simply wait indefinitely. The council session offers him the perfect moment: gathered nobles, public chaos, an opportunity to seize the throne while framing it as a response to disorder rather than a calculated betrayal. I believe he will act. Voreth studied the sketch, tracing the layout of the hall with careful eyes, thinking through every angle Caelthus might exploit. Then we need eyes on every entrance, every disguised staff member, everyone he might have placed within these walls. Over the following days, quietly and without drawing attention, Elias and a handful of trusted guards began identifying servants and attendants who had joined the palace staff in recent months, cross-referencing their backgrounds against records that, on close inspection, revealed troubling gaps and inconsistencies. 3 individuals in particular stood out: recently hired kitchen staff whose references, when quietly investigated, led to addresses that did not exist and names that appeared nowhere in any official record. These 3, Elias said, laying their information before Voreth 2 days before the council session. I believe they are Holloway's people, placed here to create the same kind of chaos we saw during the banquet, likely armed and prepared to strike the moment Kael'thas gives some signal. We cannot simply remove them without alerting Kael'thas that we know. No, but we can ensure they are watched every moment leading up to the session, and we can position our own people close enough to intervene the instant they move. If we act too early, Kael'thas retreats and tries again another day, perhaps in a way we cannot predict as easily. If we let this play out and intervene at precisely the right moment, we catch him with undeniable proof in front of every noble house gathered in that hall. Voreth felt the weight of the plan settle over her, heavy with risk, but also, she believed, their best chance at finally ending the threat that had haunted her for weeks. It is dangerous. If anything goes wrong, if we misjudge the timing even slightly, people could be hurt. I know. Elias's expression was steady, though she could see the concern beneath it. Concern not for himself, but for her, for the innocent nobles, who would be gathered in that hall, with no knowledge of the danger circling them. But the alternative is allowing Kael'thas to continue searching for new opportunities, new methods, until eventually one of his attempts succeeds. I would rather face this threat on ground we have chosen and prepared, than wait for him to choose ground of his own. She nodded slowly, trusting his judgment, in a way that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier, back when she had believed him nothing more than a harmless scholar sent to fulfill a diplomatic formality. How much had changed since that night in the banquet hall, when his hand had closed around an assassin's wrist and revealed, in a single fluid motion, an entire hidden life she had never suspected existed beneath his quiet exterior. In the final days before the session, Voreth found herself spending quiet evenings with Elias that had nothing to do with strategy or danger, moments that felt almost stolen from the growing storm surrounding them. They walked in the gardens beneath the soft blue glow of the trees, talking not of conspiracies but of smaller things, the customs of his childhood on Earth's outer colonies, her own memories of learning to rule at her mother's side, the strange, unexpected way 2 people from entirely different worlds had somehow found something real between them, despite a marriage that had begun as nothing more than political necessity. I never thanked you properly, she said one such evening, as they sat together beside one of the quiet garden fountains, for choosing to protect me, even before you told me the truth of who you were. You could have remained hidden. You could have let your training stay a secret forever, and simply lived out this marriage, as the quiet scholar everyone believed you to be. I considered it, he admitted. For a long time, keeping that part of myself hidden felt like the safest choice, both for you and for me. But watching you these past weeks, watching how fiercely you have fought to protect your people and this fragile peace, I realized I did not want to hide from you any longer. Whatever comes in that council hall, I wanted you to know exactly who stands beside you. Voreth reached for his hand, an unfamiliar gesture between them that felt, in that quiet moment, entirely natural. Whatever happens, I am glad it is you standing there. The night before the council session, sleep came slowly and uneasily for both of them. Voreth lay awake long after Elias had finally drifted into a restless rest beside her, staring at the ceiling of her chambers and running through every possible way the coming confrontation could unfold. She thought of her cousin, of the ambition she had always sensed simmering beneath his careful public composure, of the betrayal that would soon be laid bare in front of the entire court. She thought of the innocent nobles who would gather in that hall tomorrow with no knowledge of the danger surrounding them, trusting in a peace that Kael'thas had spent months quietly working to destroy. And she thought of Elias, of the quiet strength she had learned to see beneath his gentle exterior, of the trust that had grown between them, not despite the secrets he had kept, but because of the honesty with which he had finally chosen to share them. Whatever tomorrow brought, she was no longer facing it as a queen standing alone against the shadows circling her throne. She was facing it with a partner who had proven, again and again, that he would stand beside her no matter the cost. As the first pale light of morning began to creep across the horizon, Voreth finally allowed herself a few hours of uneasy sleep, gathering what strength she could before the day that would determine the fate of her throne, her people, and the fragile, hard-won peace between two worlds that had brought her and Elias together in the first place. The High Council Hall filled slowly through the morning, noble houses arriving in their formal colors, foreign envoys taking their designated seats along the outer ring, servants moving quietly among the gathering crowd with trays of refreshment that Voreth now watched with far sharper attention than she ever had before. She sat upon the raised dais at the center of the hall, dressed in the ceremonial robes of her office, her expression composed into the calm, steady authority her people expected from their queen, though beneath that composure her senses were tuned to every small movement in the room. Elias stood at her side, dressed not in his usual scholar's robes but in something plainer, something that allowed for freedom of movement, a change she had noticed that morning and understood immediately for what it meant. He scanned the gathering crowd with quiet, methodical attention, occasionally exchanging brief glances with Colette Marsh, who stood near the eastern entrance, or with the trusted guards positioned discreetly among the household staff, everyone playing their part in a plan that had been rehearsed and refined over the past several days. Kael'thas arrived among the last of the noble delegation, dressed in rich formal attire, greeting other members of the court with the same easy, practiced warmth he always displayed. If he suspected anything of the trap slowly closing around him, he gave no sign of it, taking his seat among the gathered houses with an expression of calm, patient interest, as though this were simply another routine council session rather than the moment he had spent months preparing to seize. The session opened with the usual formalities: reports on trade agreements, discussions of border disputes among minor territories, the slow, methodical business of governance that Voreth had presided over countless times before. She kept her attention divided, following the proceedings closely enough to respond when needed, while watching for any sign of movement among the 3 disguised operatives Elias had identified, all of whom stood among the serving staff along the hall's perimeter, apparently occupied with their ordinary duties. The signal, when it came, was almost imperceptible. Voreth might have missed it entirely if she had not been watching so closely. A single glance from Kael'thas toward the servant nearest the western entrance, brief and casual enough to pass for coincidence to anyone not already suspecting him. But Elias saw it too, and his hand found hers beneath the edge of the dais, a silent signal that the moment they had prepared for was finally arriving. The 3 disguised operatives moved almost simultaneously, discarding the trays they carried and reaching for weapons concealed beneath their serving robes, exactly as Elias had predicted. But before any of them could complete the motion, the guards positioned throughout the hall moved first, closing in with the swift, coordinated precision of a plan practiced and perfected over days of careful preparation. 2 of the operatives were subdued within seconds, disarmed and restrained before they could raise their weapons. The third managed to draw his blade, lunging toward the dais with clear intent, only for Elias to step forward and meet him directly, disarming him with the same fluid, practiced efficiency Voreth had witnessed twice before, though this time she watched not with shock, but with steady, unwavering trust. The hall erupted into shocked murmurs and startled cries as the gathered nobles realized what was happening, guards moving quickly to secure the perimeter, while the captured operatives were restrained and dragged from the room. Voreth rose from her seat, her voice cutting clearly through the chaos with the trained authority of a ruler who had commanded far worse crises than this. "Remain calm," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "The threat has been contained." But it did not arrive here by chance. She turned, deliberately, to face her cousin, who had risen from his seat, along with the other startled nobles, his expression carefully arranged into confusion and concern, the same practiced mask he had worn for months. But Voreth had learned, over the past weeks, to see past that mask, and she watched now for the smallest crack in his composure as she spoke. "Kael'thas," she said, and the hall fell into a heavy, uneasy silence at the sound of his name, spoken with such deliberate weight. "You signaled these men to act. I watched you do it myself. Cousin, I do not know what you believe you saw, but I assure you, you met with a man named Gareth Holloway 3 times over the past 2 months, Voreth continued, her voice steady and merciless. A disgraced intelligence operative from the human colonies, dismissed from service for selling classified methods to whoever would pay for them. You hired him to train the operatives who attacked me during the banquet, who set fire to the Eastern Archive, who nearly succeeded in destroying the treaty that secures peace between our peoples. And today, you brought 3 more of his trained agents into this hall, intending to use the chaos of their attack as cover for seizing my throne. The color drained slowly from Kael'thas's face as the accusations settled over the gathered nobles, and Voreth watched the careful mask he had maintained for so long finally begin to crack under the weight of evidence he could no longer simply deny away. Around the hall, murmurs rose among the noble houses, shock and disbelief giving way, slowly, to the dawning recognition that the accusation carried real weight behind it. You have no proof of any of this, Kael'thas said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness, a thin thread of desperation beginning to show beneath the surface. I have the testimony of a man who followed you to your meetings with Holloway, Voreth said. I have the confession already given by 2 of your captured operatives, who named you directly once faced with the consequences of their failed attack. And I have just watched you signal 3 armed men to attack this gathering in front of every noble house in this empire. For a long moment, Kael'thas said nothing, his eyes darting across the hall, as though searching for some avenue of escape, some argument that might yet save him from the accusation now laid bare before the entire court. Then, with a suddenness that caught even the guards positioned nearby off guard, he lunged not toward the exit, but toward Voreth herself, drawing a concealed blade from beneath his formal robes, his careful composure finally shattering into open, desperate aggression. You were never fit to rule, he snarled, closing the distance toward the dais with startling speed. A throne, secured by marriage to a human scholar, propped up by a peace that weakens us before every rival power in this region. I would have restored our empire's strength, and you would have simply let it wither. Elias moved before the guards could react, placing himself directly between Kael'thas and Voreth, and for the first time since the night of the banquet, Voreth watched her husband draw a blade of his own, a slender weapon he had kept concealed beneath his plain formal attire, meeting Kael'thas's attack with the same calm, practiced precision that had saved her life twice before. The confrontation was brief, though it felt to Voreth as though it stretched across an eternity, every noble house in the hall watching in stunned silence, as the man they had known as a quiet scholar met the Queen's own cousin, in a contest neither observer nor participant had ever expected to witness. Elias moved with controlled, deliberate skill, disarming Kael'thas without inflicting lasting harm, the blade clattering to the marble floor, as guards finally surged forward to restrain the Queen's cousin, dragging him back from the dais, as he continued shouting accusations that grew increasingly desperate and increasingly damning with every word. Silence fell over the hall once the guards had fully secured him, a silence heavy with the shock of everything the gathered nobles had just witnessed. Voreth stood at the center of the dais, breathing steadily despite the adrenaline still coursing through her, and looked out over the stunned faces of her court, understanding that the moment now called for words that would settle not just this crisis, but the deeper questions her people would carry away from what they had seen. For months, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, my own cousin conspired to destroy the peace this empire has worked so hard to build, using methods and resources drawn from beyond our borders, seeking to seize a throne through betrayal, rather than earn the trust of the people he claimed to serve. He very nearly succeeded, not once, but multiple times. And each time, the man many of you dismissed as a harmless diplomatic formality stood between this empire and disaster. She turned to look at Elias, who stood beside her still holding the blade that had just saved her life for a 4th time since their marriage began, his expression steady despite the weight of every eye in the hall now turned toward him. My husband, Elias Thorne, came to this court, trained in skills far beyond what any of us understood, skills he kept hidden, not out of deception, but out of a genuine desire to protect this peace, without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. I will not pretend the past months have been easy. or that I fully understood the man I married when our union was first arranged. But I stand before you today because of his vigilance, his skill, and his unwavering loyalty, not to a political arrangement, but to the safety of this empire, and everyone within it. She reached for his hand, clasping it firmly in front of the entire gathered court, a gesture far more intimate and far more public than anything their marriage had displayed before. From this day forward, let no one in this court mistake him for a mere diplomatic formality. He stands beside me, not simply as my husband, but as protector of this throne, equal in trust, and equal in the defense of everything we have built together. A murmur rippled through the hall, not of doubt this time, but of something closer to reluctant awe. Nobles who had spent months quietly mocking the quiet human scholar, now looking at him with an entirely different regard, understanding at last the depth of skill and loyalty that had been hidden beneath his gentle exterior all along. In the days that followed, Caelthus was formally stripped of his title and his place among the noble houses, his conspiracy laid bare through a thorough investigation that confirmed everything Voreth had accused him of during the council session. Gareth Holloway, the disgraced operative who had trained the disguised attackers, was tracked down through information Elias provided to his former colleagues among the human colonies, ensuring he would face justice for his role in nearly unraveling the fragile peace between two worlds. The treaty itself, once threatened by fire and betrayal, was formally reaffirmed before the full assembly of noble houses, its foundations stronger now than they had been before the crisis began, tested and proven by everything the Empire had just survived. Voreth and Elias stood together in the palace gardens on the evening after the formal reaffirmation ceremony, the blue glow of the trees casting soft light across the quiet paths where they had walked so many times over the past difficult weeks. The danger that had shadowed their marriage since its very beginning had finally passed, leaving behind not the careful, distant partnership that had defined their first 2 years together, but something far deeper, forged through shared danger and hard-won trust. "The court sees you differently now," Voreth said, watching the way the light caught in his eyes as he looked out over the gardens. "I am the same man I have always been," Elias said quietly. "Only now, they finally understand what that means." "And what does it mean to you?" He turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen during the careful, guarded early days of their marriage. "It means I no longer have to hide the parts of myself I once believed I needed to keep separate from the man you married. It means standing beside you, fully and honestly, as your protector and your partner, for whatever challenges still lie ahead of this empire, and this peace we have both fought so hard to preserve." Voreth smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, the kind she rarely allowed herself even in private. "The court once believed my human husband was harmless. I confess, for a time, I believed it too. And now? Now they know better," she said, reaching for his hand, as the last light of evening faded gently into the soft blue glow of the garden trees. "And so do I. Whatever comes next, whatever threats still wait beyond these walls, I face them knowing I do not stand alone. I stand beside the fiercest ally I never expected to find, hidden for so long beneath the quiet mask of a harmless man, until the moment he finally drew his sword and showed this entire empire exactly who he truly was." Together, they walked on through the quiet gardens, queen and protector, partners bound now not merely by treaty or political necessity, but by trust, hard-earned through fire and betrayal, ready to face whatever future still awaited the fragile, resilient peace they had fought so hard, and so successfully, to defend.